Hey everyone, welcome back to Endless Money Pits. This is a 2001 Chevrolet Corvette, and today I'll show you how to lower it with a kit we got for about $100. Last week's video showed how to lower the car by adjusting the bolts in the factory suspension, but the owner of the car wanted a little more drop in the front. The kit replaces those bolts with some that are designed to make the car drop just a little bit lower, but it should be enough to help us get the look that he's going for. At the end of the video, I'll list all the measurements comparing how much each method lowered the car compared to the factory height. Here are the tools that I used for this job. A couple torque wrenches, a couple socket wrenches, a few socket extensions, 10mm socket, 13mm socket, 15mm socket, 19mm socket, 21mm socket, crowbar, 22mm wrench, 18mm wrench, 13mm wrench, really old plastic mallet, caliper micrometer, retaining ring pliers, impact wrench, floor jack, and jack stands. For this job I also needed a creeper, a stool, a light, gloves, safety glasses, tape measure, penetrating oil, 4 wood blocks, 2 rubber mats, and a kit with front and rear lowering bolts. Start by parking the car on a flat surface. My old floor jack doesn't fit under this car anymore since I lowered it on the factory bolts, so the owner of the car actually bought me a new low-profile jack, but I still had to drive the car onto wood blocks for enough clearance. I also had to put rubber mats under 2 of the wood blocks to keep them from sliding. You can safely lift and support the C5 Corvette at these points. I'll start with the front suspension since it's more complicated. These wheels have plastic caps covering the lug nuts, so be careful not to damage them. We need to disconnect some of the suspension components, so use a jack to support the control arm, but don't block these holes. Remove the 2 bolts connecting the bottom of the shock to the control arm. Each bolt has a nut on the back, so you'll need to come up from the bottom with a socket and hold the top with a wrench. Each one is a 13mm. We'll drop the upper control arm by removing these 4 bolts with a 15mm socket. On both sides of this car, the 2 frontmost bolts had washers being used as spacers. I don't know why they're here, and I don't think it's a factory design, but I'm leaving it the way it is for now. If you can explain it, please leave a comment. Pull the arm away from the upper shock mount. Now we'll need to disconnect the sway bar. The instructions that came with the kit say to disconnect the sway bar at the end links, but it looked a lot easier to disconnect it at these mounts by removing the 4 15mm bolts. On a side note, this job inspired me to purchase an impact driver the next day. It wasn't cheap, but it would have made this job and many others much faster and easier, so I'm looking forward to using it in the future. Now we can get the height adjustment bolt most of the way out. This ring is probably here to keep the bolt from backing out, so I'll save it to put on the new one. To get the bolt all the way out, I'll use the crowbar between the control arm and the leaf spring. I use the plastic mallet to get the crowbar in further. There's a lot of pressure on the spring now, so don't put your hands anywhere that they could get pinched if the crowbar slips out. Just a little more. The rubber pads on the new bolts are about 3/8 of an inch thinner, but they're also much harder. You'll have to fully install the bolts to lower the car any more than you can with the stock bolts. Why are they so long? I don't know. The instructions say to grease the rubber pads when you install them, but I missed it and I had to do it later off camera. They also say to re-grease them every month, but that seems pretty unrealistic. Carefully use the mallet to knock the pry bar free, and raise the control arm high enough that the holes line up when you push the lower part of the shock down. Reinstall the bolts and torque the nuts on the bottom to 21 foot-pounds. Reinstall the upper control arm and torque the bolts to 48 foot-pounds. Reinstall the sway bar brackets, making sure they're seated just like they were before, and torque the bolts to 43 foot-pounds. When you're done with the front, reinstall the wheels and move to the rear. The rear suspension is a lot simpler. I used retaining ring pliers to remove the ring on the top, but you could probably pry it off with a flat screwdriver if you don't have the right tool. I wedged a 21mm socket with a wrench on the top and used an 18mm ratcheting wrench to remove the bolt from the bottom. There shouldn't be any tension on the bolt by the time the nut comes off. The new rear bolts are about 1.5 inches longer, which should allow the car to drop quite a bit. Install the new bolt with bushings and washers oriented as shown, and adjust both rear bolts to the same length. These are locking nuts, so we don't have to worry about them coming loose. I wedged a 22mm wrench on top and used a 21mm socket to tighten the bolt from below. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6. I used the micrometer to measure from the top of the bolt to the top of the nut so I could try to match it on the other side. However, a couple weeks later, we ended up tightening these bolts fully to raise the car up to the owner's desired ride height. When you're done with both sides, reinstall the wheels, lower the car to the ground, and torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. I took the car for a test drive to let the suspension settle a bit, and then I got the tape measure out again to see what happened. Everything is converted to centimeters to make it more clear, but here are the measurements I took when the car was at factory ride height, after lowering the car on factory bolts, after lowering the car on aftermarket bolts, and how much it settled each time. Compared to the factory ride height, the aftermarket bolts lowered the car an average of 4 centimeters, or a little more than 1.5 inches. After a few weeks, the owner of the car complained that the rear was too bouncy and didn't feel stable in corners, so we raised it up by 1 inch, or about 2.5 centimeters, by cranking down the rear bolts all the way. He seems really happy with it now, and the wheel gaps look more even. I have more videos on modifying your C5 Corvette, so make sure to check those out too. If you like this video, make sure to subscribe for more of the best DIY videos on the internet. And until next time, just keep throwing money at it.